earlier on today, in fact, protesters had gathered outside the Gala International Cricket Stadium, where the second cricket test match between Sri Lanka and Australia was underway. And covering that was Andrew Fidel Fernando. He's Sri Lanka's correspondent at ESPN, joining us live. So just talk us through what you witnessed earlier on during what is essentially a joyous occasion.
Yeah, I mean, it hadn't been a joyous occasion for many Sri Lankans. In this part of the country, particularly, you've been feeling the brunt of this economic crisis. Cricket generally brings people together. It is generally a joyous occasion. However, the fort area, the ground at Galle is quite unique in that you can go up to the fort and watch the match from outside the ground. And that is public space, that's a public area, had been barred by the Sri Lankan authorities. The police and army had stopped spectators from coming up there because they were using that space as, some of them were using that space as a protest site. So in the first test match last week, we saw police and army take people away from there. Eventually they banned all spectators because they couldn't stop protests from popping up on the fort and kind of garnering attention. In what is essentially kind of an international event between these two countries, between Australia and Sri Lanka. Today, though, what happened was a huge amount of protesters gathered in the center of Galle, right outside the ground. There were many of them protesters who had wanted to go on to Colombo, but as the government had stopped buses and stopped trains, they were unable to carry on to the main protests in Colombo. They gathered in Galle, people from all over the south, which, by the way, is Rajapaksa heartland. This is, they're a southern family, and their voter base is from the south. So just the mere gathering of protesters in this part of the country is quite significant. And then, because they couldn't go on to Colombo, they retook the fort, essentially. They marched up there in huge numbers. Police and army were there. Army with automatic rifles were hanging around there. But because of the sheer numbers of the protesters there, they stormed the top of the fort and took it back, which was a symbolic thing. People generally stand up there and watch cricket matches and use that area for their recreation, like kites to play. And they had been banned from that area, and this was kind of a microcosm of what was going on in the rest of the country. It was hours later that protesters in Colombo stormed the official residence of the president. But this was something symbolic and also, something quite significant in this part of the country.
Andrew, you talk about the symbolism, but when we look at what people have been living through, when you hear reports of parents having one meal a day in order to ensure that their children get something to eat, it really puts it into context why people are so angry, so frustrated and so tired with the governing family of this country.
Absolutely. This anger has been seething for many months. It's not just about the food. I think people, something as basic as dal, which is such a staple of the Sri Lankan diet, and a source of protein, is out of reach for many Sri Lankans now. People are eating rice and coconut, which is grown here, coconut sambal, and that is a meal, and often they can't afford to have more than one meal a day. People are subsisting on very little. Everybody's kind of household budgets are stretched to the limit. People are in debt. People cannot travel anywhere. People cannot travel to their workplaces. And supply chains have broken down all over the country. So every kind of business in Sri Lanka has been affected by this because there is no fuel in the country. I myself I'm covering a test in Galle. I'm cycling to the ground back and forth because there are no vehicles to take me. And there are many more people on bicycles now. It is as if a 21st century economy has been taken back to medieval times, and people are feeling the pinch. People, the people at the protest today in Galle were of all ages, of all ethnicities, of all religions, and everybody has been hit by this crisis, particularly the working and lower middle classes. But it is they who have largely driven the protests over the last few months. But everybody has been affected in some way, and there is. It's difficult to kind of really really understate the revulsion that people feel towards the leaders at the moment. And you hear that all around in conversations, in the signs that you see at protests, in the accusations being thrown at these leaders. and also in the way that these largely peaceful protests, as Marlon earlier in the show explained, it was the state that instigated the violence in Colombo today. And that has been the case all through the protests over the last few months. The state has been the instigator of violence, almost as if to provoke a violent response in order to change the narrative. That is another accusation that people all around the country are throwing at this government, that they are the ones who are instigating protests, instigating violence at these protests in order to make the protests themselves seem violent. And that is a narrative I think that has to be considered.
Andrew, we don't have much time left, but just from your understanding, from monitoring, from watching all of this, I wonder, now that we've got this announcement that President Rajapaksa will stand down on the 13th of July, can the country heal, given that it will take time for the economy to be sorted out, for basic needs to be resolved?
Well, I mean, healing in some ways, an economic crisis is indiscriminate in the way it attacks and affects everybody. We've seen in Sri Lanka, we've come out of a 27-year civil war that was based on ethnic lines. In 2009 was when that war ended. And we've had the Easter attacks in 2019. And part of what has happened during this economic crisis is that everybody has realized, or at least there's been there seems to be a mass realization that everybody's affected by the kind of majoritarian politics that the Rajapaksas in particular have played out over the last few years. And that what I'm hearing with the protests today, for example, there were Buddhist clergy members, there were Catholics, there were Catholic nuns. In other parts of the country, there have been Tamils and Hindu Swamis who've been part of these protests as well.
Understood.
And there's been kind of an
Understood. Apologies, Andrew, for breaking in there, but you paint such a vivid image of what is happening on the ground. We really do thank you for your time. Andrew Fidel Fernando, Sri Lanka correspondent for ESPN, who was at that cricket match when the protests breaking there, just that strength of feeling, and the breaking news that the president will be stepping down on the 13th of July.